Hello, everybody, and welcome to another SIG Windows meetup. This is the 11th of June. Thank you all for attending. As always, please remember that this is a recorded meeting, so use the code of conduct of CNCF and Kubernetes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about 1.15 first. The work that was done on GMSA that definitely got merged, and we were able to move forward there with some of the API changes. However, some of the other work that we had, even though we made significant contributions and a lot of effort went into them, we're not going to be able to realize any 1.15 benefits, and that's specifically on run as username, containerd, as well as the GMSA. GMSA was the one that, and kubeadm. kubeadm was the one that basically got closest to the wire. And yesterday we had PRs open around documentation and some code. And I don't see Leah on. So turned out was that we have some licensing issues on between MIT and Apache license that we still have to sort out before that documentation and scripts get put up. My personal goal, and I think we'll be able to do this, is 1.15 can ship, and if we get all the work out there, we'll still publish it. We'll put the docs in. We'll give it to customers so they can start trying it out without really having any effect on us. And Patrick did a great job last week at the community meeting, talking about where we are and where we're going, and also giving everybody a quick demo of kubeadm.
Yeah, and just to pull a little bit more on kubeadm, like the main code PRs that we needed reviewed and approved were merged. The stuff that didn't get merged was the better setup scripts, but those are things that we can carry into our own repo. So I think we could get those merged and live. I don't think it has to necessarily be tied to a release.
That's exactly my sentiment as well. And for those of you guys that don't know, we have a Kubernetes SIG repo specifically for tools for SIG Windows. So if you guys have, and I'll post the thing in the notes as well. If you have things that fit kind of that model, like tools, scripts, ancillary things on Windows that you want to publish, please let us know, and we can give you a folder into that repo, and you can place them in there. I'm posting it here right now. Anybody else have any questions or concerns about 1.15? All right, no concerns. Patrick, do you want to talk about the containers, privileged containers proposal?
Yeah, but first I wanted to double check something on that Kubernetes SIGs repo. So the PR that Ben got merged for port forwarding still depends on a binary called WinCat to be there in the pause image. And the source code is currently over in his repo. So can he move that into the SIG Windows Tools repo?
Absolutely.
Does that work for you, Ben?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Oh, yeah, sorry. I had that note down later in the list, but...
Oh, did you? Oh.
Yeah. Oh, it's all good. Since you had pasted that repo URL in there, I thought I'd bring it up. So I'll just fix those notes up later. Okay, so let me share this out. So basically, some of the background behind this was I happened to be in San Francisco like a couple of weeks before KubeCon, and so I spent a little bit more time walking through deep CSI proposal on a whiteboard with him, and the main outcome was this option C here, where I was trying to basically summarize the idea that we had, but we don't have any code for it. But basically, what I'm trying to do in this document is first kind of capture what the use cases are that we have for privileged containers today, in a way that someone that's less familiar with Kubernetes could sort of understand what the constraints are. Because I'm also sharing this with some of the developers working on the internal Windows side. But what I wanted to do was sort of frame out kind of what we need in order to make CNI and CSI drivers work, and possibly device plugins in the future. And I was trying to kind of just outline what a couple different solutions would look like that could meet these same use cases, where privileged containers is kind of what's there and what's used on Linux today. Privileged proxies are something that that Deep and Ben and others have been exploring, and that's actually detailed in the persistent storage options doc that Deep circulated earlier. And then the third option was another idea that we had been sort of kicking around but never really written down. And so this is kind of what came out of that whiteboard session. But the third idea is basically saying, well, if we can't create a privileged container, is there still a way that we can reuse a portion of the container runtime to manage the life cycle of something running on the host? So sort of pretend it's a container, but just launch it on the host. And the benefit of that would be that we could still probably reuse things like a container registry, whether it's a public one like Docker Hub or a private one running like Harbor or ACR or something like that. So that way you could at least distribute those components, pull them down, and then use something either in either some Windows specific code in a place like Containerd, or in maybe in CRI itself to actually create those processes on the host. And so that's kind of what I had outlined as option C.
Would we need to, I think with that option, Patrick, we might need to do a real threat model and include some of the security experts from Kubernetes, because this has far and wide implications, right? So now we have Containerd running a privileged host process that's getting called from a different address space, I guess.
That's true, but it's also true, although the reviewers would be different for the option B with the privileged proxy as well.
Okay.
Because if we're asking admins to install something on the host in order to support running a CSI or CNI plugin, they still need to understand what the threat model is of that thing that they're installing. And I'd really like some feedback from users here to understand, like, does having a split model where you've got a proxy installed and then you've got a container talking to it, like, is that something that is perceived as better from a usability as well as a security approach? Or does it make more sense to just say, no, let's package up the plugin as like a one unit and installed on the host, and we'll sort of version control that outside of Kubernetes as a prerequisite? Because that's kind of what the status quo is today for the kubelet and kube proxy, and so this sort of changes that a bit.
I don't know how we can get feedback on that. I think that'd be pretty hard to get feedback on this.
Hey, one question I had around option C, like maybe I can find this information, but just was wondering if someone knows off the top of their heads, is with a pod, is it possible to mix the runtime classes? As in, can you have like a mainline, say a mainline workload that's deployed as a process class, and then can there be sidecars that are containerized, or do all of them need to be process or a VM or a container? Any thoughts on it?
So, sorry, what do you mean by having a sidecar for option C? Could you repeat that again?
Yeah, so like this is very specific to in the context of CSI. So basically it's the CSI plugin, which is fairly agnostic of the orchestrator that's involved. And there's a sidecar typically that goes with the CSI plugin that kind of ties it to Kubernetes concept. Like,
and that's for each pod using a persistent volume?
no, this is for each of the plugins. It's kind of like the daemon set that's deployed.
Okay.
So my my question was, like, let's say, we have this privileged plugin, either containerized or running as a host process. Is it possible to package in a sidecar container that is common and published by, say, Kubernetes CSI to be launched as a container, or does that also need to be a process? I guess my question is, like, if there's a pod, do all the components in the pod need to be like of a single runtime class, or can they be of different runtime classes?
Runtime classes on the pod itself, not on the containers.
Okay. So you cannot have, say, a Hyper-V isolated container and a process container running.
Yeah. That's
interesting. So this would mean, in the context of CSI, that the node driver registrar also becomes a process, or needs to be launched as a process, which is probably okay, but yeah.
Can I just ask, what's the main difference between option A and C?
Option A doesn't exist.
Oh, but if you, like, say, C already exists, you mean?
Well, so option A, the key thing here is that we would need to wait on a future version of Windows in order to support running a privileged container. And so at the earliest, that could the next release of Windows would be this fall. And so if we got it there, that would be a semi-annual channel release, which expires in 18 months. And so customers would have to deploy in order to get that feature, assuming that feature exists, and then turn around and switch to a new build of Windows 2 more times before they could get to the next long-term servicing release, which my best guess would be 2021. There's no announcement that far out, but given that the 2019 release is a long-term servicing release, and the previous one was 2016, I think that it would be 2 or 3 years before we see another long-term servicing release. And the main feedback I've had from on-premises customers is that deploying a new Windows release every 18 months is too fast. And so I think we might be able to do it, within the context of a cloud provider, but I don't know that all customers would be able to do it. And so if we were to say that we only support option 1 for CSI and CNI, we're basically saying that we'll have to have a separate solution for customers that want to use Windows Server 2019, which is what we declared stable for Windows Server support. And so if we go with option A, I think we still need some other alternate approach to follow for the older 2019 release.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. Actually, I should have read this before. So C, that means you already have some way of doing it It's just implement that part.
So with option C, you do not need like any kernel level support. It's mainly using existing say containerd or CRI constructs to get the same effect as option A. But it's just like trying to use existing Kubernetes mechanisms to kind of make something that's potentially packaged as a container, launch as a host process.
Yeah. B and C are focused around things that could be done on the open source side without changes to Windows.
Yeah, I see you already write down quite some details about downside and benefits of each approach. So right now, by comparing B and C, we haven't reached a conclusion. But from your comparison, it seems like C is better, or?
Well, I think C is a little bit cleaner from a management standpoint, in that we could potentially get visibility for those privileged workloads at the Kubernetes API level, but it's it's a lot more work, and it's a different threat model than option B, or what I realized for option D is basically what we're doing today.
Also, I think like option C can also branch out into many different options, like having a native CRI model versus, if people are using containerd, a containerd shim, or something completely different.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and this is just kind of one proposed way we could do that, and I think there's other like you could basically pick a layer and this is where it can create a host process instead of a container. And I think that could happen at any of the layers. We would just have to pick one.
So you said the thread model is different between B and C. So what can you just give some details about that model you mean?
So with option B, what we basically be doing is because we're just exposing a privileged API endpoint, the way you protect that could be a little bit more better constrained than in option C. And the reason why is that it's relatively easy to describe things like network or mount policies today, and we could probably do it without too many changes in the context of a pod security policy. We could say, mounting these types of host paths are not allowed, unless you've opted into, unless you're declaring that you're using a specific pod security policy, and the Kubernetes service principal that's being used to do that meets the RBAC rules to deploy with that policy. Whereas in option C, we're basically because things are happening at a different layer, and it looks like creating a pod, you'd have to do a deeper inspection of what's being passed through the API to figure out if they're trying to elevate privilege.
So the security attack surface is not as clear as the option B.
Yeah, I mean, in option C, we'd basically probably be relying on some annotations or something like that, which are ignored and not present on Linux. Whereas in option B, blocking host path mounts is already a known quantity. People know how to do that.
So it's just my very initial thoughts based on the description. It seems like B may be easier, and also if we say this is kind of in a phase we might change later, and maybe go with the easier way and the more understandable way is better. It's just my thoughts. Instead of go the more complicated way at this time, at right now, as of right now.
So, sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh,
Which
so
part
I'm
was
just,
more complicated?
it seems like option C is a little bit more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And also, as you mentioned, the security, like how to, the threat model is a little bit maybe more complicated compared to B two. So based on these 2 points, I'm just thinking maybe option B is better at this point, because later we might still change if we have support, let's say privileged container or something else. So if we want to have something available for users, maybe option B is right now is better. It's just my thoughts, yeah.
Yeah, and I do think that, with option B and C, if privileged containers were available later, you could probably take the same code that you wrote, package it up in a container, and run it under option A. So, I don't think it's necessarily going to be a code reuse problem, but I think that we'd get to a point where we'd have to tell people that, okay, when you move to this new version of Windows, if you want to use a new deployment methodology, here's how you change your deployment steps.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing about option C is I really don't. If we go down option C, we also need to have a deprecation path for it as well, and that's just something that we'd have to keep in mind. So if we finished it today, we'd have to keep it around for at least a year, I think.
Yeah.
So let's move on a little bit since we only have a few more minutes left. We can definitely revisit this discussion again next week once folks had a chance to kind of look at the document and go through all the details in there.
I did have one question on option B. So there was a point made, I think, that PSP pod security policies may not be supported on Windows. Do you have any other more details around it, Patrick?
It's so basically nobody's done that investigation.
Yep.
Yeah. So like if we're going to do option B, that's part of the due diligence we would need to complete. Okay. Well, but yeah, so if everybody could take a look and add some comments in there, and we can continue this discussion next week. But my main goal is to try to just facilitate a discussion around some of the different options that are here, so that way we, get some more viewpoints on it. So
I don't think commenting is enabled, at least in the link that I got.
Oh, it's not?
Yeah, I think you have to share a link that allows commenting or something. Oh, it looks like other people can comment. I'll double check the link.
Make sure you're in the Kubernetes Dev and SIG Windows Google groups.
I'm signed in with my other Google account. That's the problem.
Oh, okay, that's the problem. Yeah, because I think I opened it up to Kubernetes Dev because I wanted to, once we did a first pass, I wanted to make sure that we could get people, like Jing and others over in SIG storage to be able to comment on it without having to join the SIG Windows groups. So.
Cool. Deep, very quickly, did you want to give an update on the CSI plugin support for Windows?
Yeah, pretty much it's a continuation of the discussion. So I'm still investigating option B. So I made some pretty good progress. I'm running into a couple of issues with the actual mount propagation to happen from the host to the container, but mainly playing around with the link stuff. So hopefully I can set up for a demo by next week.
Okay, cool. All right, and we have a couple of minutes left. One of the other things I've asked, and I don't know if Ben hasn't replied to me, maybe he has time, maybe he has not, is to investigate some of the storage options for vSphere. So we know a lot of the folks are installing Windows containers on vSphere, so we'd love to see what kind of options we have from a storage perspective. So if Ben has some time, hopefully he can tackle that. If not, if there's anybody else that has some time from our community that wants to look into this, let us know. We'll look you into that discussion as well.
Is that specifically with vSphere volume or like iSCSI, NFS in general?
So NFS and iSCSI, you've done that work, right? So we know that works. And this is more for vSphere persistent volumes and storage classes coming from vSphere.
And so this would be like a VMDK that's attached to the VM?
That's right.
Or vSAN, I suppose. Okay.
Yeah. So we have a lot of folks that are asking about this, so I want to see where we are on that. Cool. All right. We have a minute left. Any questions, concerns, anything that anybody else wants to bring up? All right. We'll finish a minute early. Well, thank you all for attending. Thank you for all the hard work that everybody did for 115. We'll showcase that slowly. Some of these things like Kalia's work and Lubomir's and Ben's is going to come in out of cycle, and then the rest of the things will show a lot of value in 116. So thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you guys next week.
All right.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.